And just a reminder to everybody that we are recording.
And turn off your cell phones.
All right, so it's almost 11 o'clock here on the East Coast of the US. Carly, do we know how many people have joined?
We have 20 attendees so far, 21. It looks like, yeah, people are
starting to come in.
Yep.
Okay, so we'll wait another minute before we get started. Sitting in the sun here. Ah. All right, I think in the interest of time and respecting everybody's time across the globe here, we'll get started. So welcome to the first ISCHE virtual meeting. Good morning, afternoon, and evening. My name is Wendy Heiger-Bernays, and I'm the Vice President of the International Society for Children's Health and Environment. We're thrilled to see so many of our members and some new names and faces. ISCHE is an organization that speaks to many of us because the members seek to use the science to influence improvements in children's health. For more information about the organization, I encourage you to take a look at our website. At a time when so many across the globe are adversely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic, and many of us are exhausted from the interminable Zoom calls, we seek interaction with colleagues and friends. So for an hour and a half, we will share each other's company and explore a topic that moves us from our traditional one chemical and one health outcome at a time, particularly when children's health is impacted by multiple environmental conditions, chemicals, climate, COVID, racism, underlying health conditions, environmental injustices. Before we begin, I thank the work of the others who helped plan this session. Bruce Lanphier, President of ISCHE. Bruce, you can wave. Mark Miller, past president, and Carly Hyland, PhD candidate in the Environmental Health Sciences Center for Environmental Research and Children's Health at the UC Berkeley School of Public Health, without whom this session, the newsletters, and meetings for ISCHE could not happen. So thank you, Carly. Today we highlight work from the Suarez family, from Dr. Jane Monk and Dr. Valerie Bluebird-Jernigan on collaborative and community-based approaches to reduce children's exposure to chemicals in food. Farm to Table, maybe a kitschy title, but one that recognizes that children are exposed to environmental hazards from the point of growing the food to consumption, but also recognizes the social, political, and economic challenges of making change to improve children's health. As with in-person ISCHE retreats, we intend for this to be an interactive session. We will not have Q&A after each presentation in order to allow time for the larger group discussion. So after the short talks by the speakers, we will open up the webinar so that we can see one another and can engage in dialogue. If you do have a burning question about one of the slides or topics, please put them in the chat box, and Carly and I will pose them to the presenters at the beginning of the discussion. For the discussion, we ask that you use the raise hand function if you have a new question or topic that you'd like to discuss. And if you have a comment or question relevant to the topic currently being discussed, we ask you to send a message in the chat, and then we will unmute you. The speakers' biographies and slides will be located on the ISCHE website if you want to know more about them. And this webinar is being recorded and will be disseminated online after the event on that very same website. If you attend this webinar, you're agreeing to have your voice and video recorded if your camera and/or microphone are turned on. After our virtual meeting, we'll send you a very brief evaluation survey which will help us improve our virtual presence and tailor perhaps future meetings to your interests. So please take the 2 or 3 minutes to respond. So let's begin. First of all, we thought we would have 3 speakers, but we got lucky and we have 5. So we'll start with the Suarez family. Dr. Jose Ricardo Suarez is an associate professor in the Division of Global Health, Department of Family Medicine and Public Health at UC San Diego, where his research focuses on understanding the role of environmental contaminants, primarily pesticides and persistent organic pollutants, on developing systems including neurocognitive, mental health, endocrine, and other physiologic outcomes. His father, Dr. Suarez Torres Sr., is a physician and epidemiologist who's executive director of Fundación Chimas del Ecuador, an Ecuadorian PI for the project Secondary Exposure to Pesticides in Children and Adolescents at UCSD. And his mother, Dr. Dolores Lopez, is president of the Fundación Chimas del Ecuador and co-director of the Minnesota Studies in International Development Program. As an anthropologist, her work focuses on ancestral Andean medicine, changes in food security, and consumption of local participatory processes in search for development alternatives defined by the people. We'll then move to Dr. Jane Monk, who is Managing Director and Chief Scientific Officer at the Charitable Food Packaging Forum Foundation in Zurich, Switzerland. The foundation is a research and science communication organization focusing on chemicals in all types of food contact materials. Of critical importance is her work to highlight significant challenges in the risk assessment of food contact chemicals and how existing regulations are ineffective at protecting children's health from exposure to food contact chemicals and how key gaps can be overcome. And we'll complete our presentations with Dr. Valerie Bluebird Jernigan, who is an indigenous Choctaw community-based participatory researcher in intervention science, whose goal is to do research for action and social change. Dr. Jernigan is a professor of rural health and the director of the Center for Indigenous Health Research and Policy at Oklahoma State University Center for Health Sciences. She led the NHLBI-funded Thrive study, the first randomized trial of healthy makeovers in tribally owned convenience stores, and the NIMHD-funded Fresh study, a farm-to-school intervention to reduce obesity among indigenous families. So without further ado, let's start with the Suarez family, who will discuss small-scale agroecology needed to sustain communities, reduce agrochemical pesticides and fertilizers, and improve children's nutrition. So take it away. Okay, Jose.
You're muted.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Jose Suarez Torres. I am very pleased to make this presentation in this very important webinar with my wife, Dolores Lopez, and our son, Jose Ricardo, who is a professor at the University of California, San Diego. We would like to share our 30 years of experience linking academic programs and research projects in support to local communities in the Pedro Moncayo County in the Andean part of Ecuador. We follow a holistic approach to health with a social and historical perspective in order to understand the impact of colonialism and the new models of development that has implemented in our countries and their impacts on the living and health conditions of the people. At the same time, we have been exploring for ways to build alternatives with the people and from the people, from their own culture, to meet the fundamental needs that this pandemic had made evident: love, solidarity, and food. In this historical timeline in Pedro Moncayo, there are two events that shaped the health of the people of the county. One was the colonial hacienda imposed in the 1500s that produced social and environmental changes that led to chronic undernutrition and endemic goiter and endemic cretinism that continue until 1970. And in the more recent years, the globalization strategies stimulated the production of new commodities for the international market, which is the cut flowers for exportation. The rural scenery of the county was changed by the expansion of the greenhouses, and now the Pedro Moncayo is the main exporter of roses. There have been significant impacts. One is the rapid population growth for the county because of the higher demand of labor force of the flower plantations, which double the growth rates of Ecuador. The increment of degenerative diseases while maintaining undernutrition of children at 31%, as well as poverty at 77%, with serious environmental impacts like land erosion and high use of pesticides. Fundación CIMAS contributed with the development of a local geo-referenced community information system. And through the system, we are able to identify at the community and family levels more than 300 variables. And in this map, for example, we are presenting the location of the children under 3 in the communities in the La Esperanza parish. This information system supported the construction of alternatives from the cultural perspective of the people, which were included in the parish development plans. In the 6 areas considered in the plans, it's highlighted some of the main priorities, like food security, agroecological production, reduction of malnutrition, restoration of natural resources, and a reduction of the pesticide use. This consideration led to the implementation of 2 important approaches. One is the implementation of the agroecological demonstration farm, which Dolores will be addressing in a little while, and an epidemiological approach of the SPINA project, which Jose Ricardo will be addressing next.
Good morning. In response to these concerns of the health effects of pesticide exposures defined by the Pedro Moncayo County development plans, we established the SPINA study, which is the study of secondary exposures to pesticides among children and adolescents. And I am Jose Ricardo Suarez. I am the principal investigator and founder of the SPINA study, which is an interinstitutional and interdisciplinary study. And it's a prospective cohort of children aimed at understanding whether pesticides may be affecting their development. And this study started in 2008, and it had rather modest beginnings. I was finishing the first year of my PhD at the University of Minnesota, and I decided to write this grant to establish this study, which was then funded by ISCHE. And I had also written some other small grants within the University of Minnesota, which also got funded. And so we ended up pooling this money. I flew down to Ecuador with a nurse. And then once we were there, we hired some psychologists, some community health workers. And then building on the Silk platform that my father described, we were able to recruit and examine, in this case, 313 boys and girls. And we did so in a very short period of time of about 36 days or so, capitalizing on the Silk system, of course. And at the time, participants were between 4 and 9 years of age. So, of course, this ended up being my PhD dissertation, and I graduated eventually. Then I did a postdoc in cardiovascular diseases, and then I accepted a faculty position in the Department of Family Medicine here at UC San Diego. Then after that, kept on writing grants, which fortunately got funded. And right now we have about $7 million in active research grants for this project, with a couple of larger grants, primarily funded by NIEHS from the NIH, and we have some training grants as well for our junior faculty. And so with that, we did a follow-up in 2016. Now the children became adolescents, and we expanded the cohort to about 554 boys and girls. And now we have scheduled the 2021 follow-up examination, which is an interesting period as they're transitioning now into young adulthood. With ISCHE, we tend to have large amounts of staff during the active collection period, and sometimes we may have up to 40 staff actively being involved in the process. And we tend to do all the examinations in Pedro Moncayo County, and we tend to take over whole schools or other community centers to do the different parts of the study, including the examinations of participants and collection of biospecimens, processing those specimens there on site, and then freezing them in Quito. And then eventually those have made it over here to UC San Diego, where we have our biorepository with about 16,000 biospecimens right now. Here's just a summary of the measurements in case you're interested, and we're always happy to collaborate. I think you have access to the PDFs. Just to highlight, we collect a lot of information over different points in time, from geospatial. A central piece is the neurocognitive mental health assessments. We have also other measurements in blood, like inflammation markers and enzymes, measurements of hormones. We've done spirometries at different points in time. And then another core piece to our work is the biomonitoring, in which we have measurements of many metabolites for many types of insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, persistent pollutants, and soon metabolomics, when we will be able to have thousands of different metabolites, the information of those. So as a way to address the issues of pesticide exposures and the issue of children's undernutrition, which within our cohort we've seen it get worse actually in this county, kind of going beyond dissemination of epidemiological findings, we have established the Cinca agroecological farm, which my mother Dolores will be talking about next.
Buenos días, buenas tardes. My name is Dolores Lopez, and in response to this reality, we are going to present the Intercultural Center for Training and Agroecology. It's a local alternative to feed the communities with healthier nutritional production, developed with the support of Fundación CIMAS, with the funding from Rotary clubs, the active participation of the local governments, and the organizations of Pedro Moncayo County in Ecuador. This alternative was developed in La Esperanza County, in which half of the population is indigenous. What we observe in this parish is similar to what happens in the whole county and in the Andean area. loss of agricultural diversity, high use of agrochemicals, and increased children malnutrition. As a local alternative, agroecological production has been developed. Through a participatory, private, public, community, and volunteer articulation, the demonstrative farm SINCA was organized with the objectives to achieve a pesticide-free agriculture, a production of nutritious vegetables, stimulate economic alternatives and training in agroecology, with the hope to reduce the undernutrition in the county. Components that were developed: implementation of the farm, production and marketing, training courses, bioconstructions, and microcredits for families trained at the SINCA. The land is 3.5 acres, which has several components that have been developed. The implementation of the farm started with an ancestral ceremony. The eroded land to the left that you are seeing was transformed by an agroecological production with the right picture that you are seeing, to serve as an example for rural families. The agroecological products like chard, kale, garlic, celery, broccoli, etc. are produced at the farm. The sustainability is achieved by the commercializations in the farmers market in La Esperanza and neighborhood fairs in Quito. Another important component is the training of rural families in agroecology, including soil restoration, environmental restoration, water management, and ancestral farming. The courses include the preparations of organic fertilizers also and biols, as you are seeing now in this slide. A lab for trichoderm production for biological fungal control is in the process of implementation. This was delayed because of the COVID pandemic. Native seed bank was implemented to recuperate the ancestral seeds to be reproduced and distributed in the communities. Bioconstructions courses were also developed using natural materials. Using different techniques, houses like tapia, cob, bamboo were constructed. These constructions included a kitchen, bedrooms, and bathrooms that had been used by volunteers that had come to help at the SINCA. Recycled materials like tires were used to build this house, which are inexpensive and environmental friendly. Also, another technique developed was the bareke construction, was used for the construction of this auditorium that serves for the training of the people. An important support for the people was the implementation of a microcredit program oriented for families that received the training at SINCA to develop their own agroecological farm. Here you can see in that picture families that are showing their different products in a community fair. We are in the process to obtain funds to develop this mobile market for the Quito neighborhoods. Farm to the table, this is the objective. Cooking classes by chefs has been done in Quito using the products of the farm. The volunteer support has been a key component of this project, and we have had over 250 volunteers from all over the world. We would like to thank our sponsors for their support. Big dreams are possible if we join the efforts for the benefit of the people. If you would like additional information, or if you would like to contribute to this cause, please contact us. We have directed also study abroad programs and faculty-led programs for over 30 years with the University of Minnesota and other universities. Volunteers helping the projects are welcome, so join us. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to the Suarez family. We're going to move on, and we're going to now turn this over to Dr. Jane Monk. The majority of children in the developed world consume food that has been moderately or heavily processed. Little is known about the impact of the industrialized processing on exposure to potentially toxic chemicals. So Jane will share some of her work on efforts to decrease exposures of endocrine disrupting chemicals to children and pregnant women in food packaging materials. Take it away, Jane.
Thank you, Wendy, and thank you so much to ISCHE for having me be part of this. Let me just say it's a tough act to follow the Suarez family. You guys are amazing. I'm very overwhelmed with all the great work you do. Thank you for doing that. People always wonder about my strange accent. So I'm based in Zurich in Switzerland, but I'm actually from South Africa originally. Came to Europe as a child because my parents actually were fleeing the apartheid regime. So I have a history of colonialism in my family, but I also have a rebellious streak. And I guess that's maybe why I ended up working on this topic now, because you know, my background is actually environmental science. I'm an environmental chemist and environmental toxicologist by training. I worked in academia for many years looking at endocrine disruptors in aquatic ecosystems, and then decided to leave academia, shift careers, started working for a company that's a supplier for the packaging industry, and they asked me to look at food packaging, chemicals in food packaging, and compare the different materials. And what really amazed me when I started digging into that was that the chemicals we were trying to get out of aquatic ecosystems, because we were so concerned about their impacts on fish, on invertebrates, on the entire ecosystem, are chemicals that are being used to make food contact materials. So food packaging, the equipment to process foods, and so on. And that is just, that kind of hasn't let me go. So I've been working on this for the last 13 years, trying to understand how it's possible that, you know, on the one hand, we get the stuff out of the wastewater treatment plant, but, you know, it's fine to have it in direct contact with our food, have it migrate or transfer from the packaging into the food, have pregnant women, aspiring fathers, young developing children ingest these chemicals with their food. And that's what's driving me. And what's also driving me is that this actually is a moral dilemma, and that's where my rebellious streak comes in. There are thousands of untested chemicals that are in food packaging, and some of those are known chemicals. They're known to be used in food packaging. Still, they're not properly tested. For example, impacting the immune system, impacting the neurological system. But on top of that, there are thousands and thousands of chemicals that are not even known to the producers of these materials. So basically, you walk into a shop, whether it's in Switzerland, in the US, or in Ecuador, anywhere in the world, you buy food packaging with food in it, of course, and you don't think about the packaging because you think, well, it's being sold here in a shop. It's safe, right? And the regulation will say it is safe, but they have a different definition of safety than I would have. And my definition of safety is it doesn't contain hazardous chemicals, it doesn't contain untested chemicals. That sadly is not the case. That's not the case today. Okay, so let's dive into this. Wendy, you'll cut me off after 8 minutes, right? We agreed on that. So let's get some terms right here, or straight. So we talk about food contact chemicals, and that is not a legal term. That's a term that we actually came up with to simplify the discussion. It's a very complicated topic, and in order to change the situation, you have to understand, you have to understand, get an overview, understand what the problem is. So that's mostly what we've been doing these last 13 years. So food contact chemicals describes all the chemicals that are present in your finished food contact article. So that could be packaging, that could be a yogurt cup like you see it here, right? That's a food contact article. Food contact articles are not always packaging. It's, as I said before, it's also processing equipment. You have it in transport, maybe, yeah, you have it, the packaging, but you also have it when you prepare your food and so on. So I'd like you to think of food contact articles, not just of food packaging, because all of those are relevant for transfer of chemicals into food. It's not just the packaging. So the food contact article is made up of different materials. And in this example of the yogurt cup, you've got at least 5 different materials here. So you've got the plastic. So the cup is probably plastic, polystyrene probably. You've got a lid, which could be made with aluminum. Then you have a coating on the aluminum. You have an adhesive that glues the aluminum onto the plastic cup. And then you have printing inks printed on the aluminum and on your plastic cup, and so on. So that's also really important to keep in mind. People often kind of use these terms interchangeably. Food contact article, food contact material, it's not really clear what they're talking about. So we really try to use the terms with the, precise meaning. And as I said before, important to keep in mind, food contact chemicals don't only get into food from packaging. In fact, some of them, like the phthalates, for example, they actually seem to have more sources upstream, so before they're packaged into the packaging. Okay, so why is this important? As I said before, these chemicals can transfer from the packaging into the food. I'll keep this really short and simple. This is my blow up of a packaging. Here you have the food stuff. Here's the outside. Here's your bottle, whatever material, maybe it's plastic. The little red dots here are small molecules. These can be chemicals that are present because they haven't completely reacted to what they were supposed to react. In the case of plastic, if you've got a monomer, you're building a polymer out of that. You have residual monomer. There can be reaction byproducts. Making plastic is a very complex, aggressive chemical reaction. You get a lot of reaction byproducts. And also keep in mind, you're not working with pharmaceutical grade chemicals here. You're working with batches of chemicals that have 80 or 90% purity. So the other 10 or 20% of gunk impurities, they're also in your packaging. They can also react and so on. And these are what we call the non-intentionally added substances. They don't have a technical function, but they're still in the packaging. Now let's look at the number of chemicals here. This is from an enforcement officer here in Zurich, actually. And he estimates potentially migrating substances from food contact articles up to 100,000 chemicals. The ones that are actually listed as being used to make the different materials are about 10,000. We actually are just about to publish a database of intentionally used substances, and we've got over 12,000 in there. So you can see factor 10 here. So why factor 10 intentionally used and migrating? Well, these are these non-intentionally added substances, excuse me, or the reaction byproducts. So you can say 5 to 10 reaction byproducts, impurities, and so on per intentionally added substance. In Europe, this is a EU-centric perspective. Sorry, I warned you already when we were preparing this call. We've got about 1,000 regulated, which means authorized for use in plastic, actually, because the other materials don't have explicit authorization, technical detail. In the US, it's a few more. But that doesn't mean that these are thoroughly toxicologically evaluated. Just keep that in mind. And again, this number here, again, factor 10. So here we're talking about up to 100, probably less, are the ones that are actually enforced, that are actually controlled. It's probably far, far, far less. And that's also interesting to keep in mind when you think about the pesticides, what the Suarez family were talking about before. Pesticides are extremely well-characterized chemistry. Here, the levels are much higher, what migrates into food, and the chemistry is not well-characterized. And actually, some of these chemicals used in food packaging also are biocides or pesticides even. Okay, so people will say, yeah, okay, you've got 100,000 chemicals migrating, but they all migrate at low levels. So why are you upset about this? I mean, we know only the dose makes the poison. The Paracelsus paradigm. Paracelsus actually born just 20 miles away from where I'm standing right now. So, but a few centuries ago. Paracelsus, of course, was looking at acute toxicity. We are looking at chronic toxicity. We're looking at effects during fetal development, during childhood development, and there you don't need high levels to cause permanent damage. We all know that. Plus, we're not looking at single substances. We're looking at mixtures of these chemicals. And so if you have 100 or 1,000 chemicals that can migrate from plastic or paper packaging into your food at the same time, that's what you will be ingesting, that's what the child will be ingesting, that's what the child's body needs to be dealing with. And that mixture of all of those synthetic man-made chemicals can act together and affect the organism, even though the levels may be below individual thresholds of concern. So low doses indeed actually do matter. And yeah, I'm sure most of you are very familiar with the effects of endocrine disruptors. They can be affecting many different parts of the organism. Why? Because the endocrine system controls many different parts of the organism and interacts with the immune system and the nervous system. So the effects of chemicals that can interact with the endocrine system are very broad and very scattered, even at low levels. So importantly, and I guess I will stop then, Wendy, what can you do? How can you protect your health or your child's or your patient's health? Of course, we do know that consumer choice can affect health. There were a couple of studies looking into that, notably one done by the Silent Spring Institute in the US about 8 years ago. It was published, where people were put on a diet. Before they went on the diet, their urine levels were monitored for bisphenol A and for some of the phthalates. They were put on a plastic-free, packaging-free diet. Urine levels decreased, and then afterwards they went back to their normal diet and the urine levels went up again. But that is something that you can only do if you're educated and if you have a choice, if you can avoid certain types of packaging or you can avoid processed foods entirely. And oftentimes, as a consumer, you don't have a choice. You can buy different types of milk, soy milk, almond milk, fat-free milk, lactose-free milk, and so on. It's all packaged in a plastic-coated beverage carton. And you don't know before, even if it's in a glass bottle, you don't know what the tubing was that this food went through. So I think there's a lot of work to be done here. I'm actually working with the Swiss Organic Food Association right now. They're keen to tackle the issue, not only of packaging, but also of migration during food processing. And we're working on developing some guidelines there. There's a couple of other groups working on this issue. So luckily there's increasing awareness, but I think there needs to be much more done, because it's something that we can easily tackle, probably much more easily than pesticides in the environment. So with that, I would like to just plug a shameless advertisement, plug this work, an article that we published earlier this year It's a scientific consensus statement by 33 international scientists on the impacts of food contact chemicals on human health. And here we list the facts and the uncertainties and what we think should be the next steps moving forward.
Thank you. Oh,
Yeah, no, so do you want me to stop?
yes. I mean, even though this is the work that keeps me up at night, and we'll get back in conversation though.
Great. Thank
During
you so
discussion.
much. Sorry for going over my time.
No, that's fine. You're several hours ahead of us, so you've been up a while and you've had a lot of caffeine probably. All right, so thank you, Jane. Now we will hear from Valerie, who will share some of the community-based participatory work to get healthy foods on the table in Native American communities. So thank you, Valerie.
Thank you. And just to confirm, so it looks like Carly's going to be advancing my slides for me. Okay. So hello and thank you everyone for your attendance at this webinar. I really appreciate the organizers. I've had a wonderful chance to get to know some of the other panelists, and I'm really grateful to be included. I'm going to be sharing with you a bit about our efforts to restore indigenous food systems here in the US to improve Native health. And specifically, I'll share some information about our FRESH study, which is funded by the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities. Next slide. As was said, I'm a professor at Oklahoma State University, and this is my team. And I just wanted to make a special note that we're actually home to the first tribally affiliated medical school in the United States. The Oklahoma State University College of Medicine at Cherokee Nation just launched this fall and welcomed its first incoming class. And so we're very excited to be part of that campus and to do the research work that we do. Next slide. One of our studies, as I said, is the FRESH study, which is community-based participatory research study. It's in partnership with the Osage Nation, which is located here on the map, circled in the northeastern corner of the state of Oklahoma. Our partnership with Osage began about 2 years before we applied and received funding for the FRESH study, and was initiated by the Osage leadership, who, in their words, wanted to do as they did 200 years ago, which is to feed their own people. In order to do that, the leadership repurposed reservation land for the development of a farm, the Bird Creek Farm, and their vision was to create a sustainable food system and to cultivate indigenous food sovereignty. Next slide. Indigenous food sovereignty is generally defined as not only the right, but also the responsibility of indigenous people to healthy and culturally appropriate foods produced through traditional practices. It's a framework that really helps communities take control over their food systems and create access to healthy and traditional foods, while at the same time really reducing dependency on fast foods and packaged foods. And it's similar to other public health initiatives that call for upstream interventions that have a broad impact on diet, health, and the environment. Next slide. Osage Nation leadership suspected that launching this farm, in addition to providing access to healthy foods, would also most likely lead to improved health among their citizens, but they really didn't know how to go about assessing this. They had approached us at the center early on and discussed ways to create a study that might evaluate the impact of this new farm on tribal health. Their leadership had invested in this farm, but they understood that really in order to continue this investment, they would need to persuade their Congress, as they have a three-branch government like in the US, that this was a worthy investment, and they wanted to use scientific research and data to inform tribal policy. And I want to emphasize here that this really embodies the promise of CBPR in my view. Communities using research parallel with their own vision for a healthy, safe community. And I always emphasize this to my students that in my experience, communities want rigorous, well-developed science. And they want all kinds of data, but that's not all they want. They want their processes and preferences respected, and they don't want Western science at the expense of or privileged over their own ways of knowing. So we developed the FRESH study, which is a culturally relevant, multi-component, multi-level farm-to-school intervention with the goal to increase vegetable and fruit intake among Native children. And we also had the goal to disseminate findings to assist other tribes in improving their own food systems and health. Next slide. This was a waitlist control study with 4 communities as our unit of randomization, and a total of 9 early childhood education centers, or ECEs, across these communities. So the inclusion criteria, you had to be American Indian, have a child aged 3 to 5 enrolled in one of the ECEs, live on the reservation, and have no plans of moving within the next year. The intervention was implemented in 2018 with 2 communities randomized to receive the intervention in the spring, and then the other 2 communities got it the following fall. The intervention was 15 weeks with a total of 369 participants. And I want to say here that unfortunately, due to the small enrollment size of the ECEs that year, this study was underpowered, which is one of the big challenges of doing small population science. When you're doing research with Native communities, our samples are often limited. In this case, I think we recruited about 97% of eligible families. So we really just couldn't get the numbers. And we were looking primarily at outcomes of increased fruit and vegetable consumption in the children, but we did also look at some outcomes among the adult parent caregivers, specifically food insecurity, vegetable and fruit consumption, BMI, and blood pressure. Next slide. As I said, it's multi-level. So at the environmental and policy levels, we got to work with the farm that Osage Nation had launched. But at the school and community and family levels, that's really where we concentrated. At the school level, the children received the 15-week curriculum, and that was focused on sensory, gardening, cooking, and cultural healthy eating. And they received take-home recipe kits each week with produce provided by Bird Creek Farm. The teachers also helped us co-design the curriculum and develop the components, as well as translate a lot of the pieces into Osage language and how to deliver it within their classrooms. They were provided with supplies, and we built demonstration gardens at each of the ECEs so they could use the gardens with their teaching. We also created a classroom feeding training to help encourage certain styles of serving the food to promote healthy eating. And we created with the cooks a best practice menu that incorporated Bird Creek Farm produce, and it reduced pre-fried foods. It provided about 4 to 5 extra servings of vegetables per week. For the parent intervention, we didn't directly intervene on their dietary intake, but we did offer a series of brief web-based videos that included tips and strategies on how to help their kids eat vegetables. We also had 4 monthly in-person traditional foods and cooking workshops to promote healthy eating. And at that point, we really got into food sovereignty, and we talked a lot about traditional Osage foods, as well as the relationship between the food system and health. Next slide. So this is just a nice picture of our garden beds before and after we started growing. And those were really a wonderful component of the intervention. You can see the kids really love spending time out there. The findings of this study, if you want to go to the next slide. So we were really surprised that we did actually see some increases in the vegetable and fruit intake among the children in the intervention group. And we also saw the parents have increases in their vegetable intake. The parents in the intervention group also had reductions in their BMI and in percentage of the group that had hypertension. And both of those actually increased in the control group. And we saw pretty significant reductions of food insecurity in both the control and intervention communities. There were rates of about 35% and 43%, 44% initially. And both of those rates went down to about 22% and 29%. So they had about a 13-point difference before and after the intervention. And we'd like to attribute that to the farm because there really wasn't anything else going on in the community that might have contributed to that. There were a lot of excess produce that we gave to the families at the end of each week that some of the kids just took home and some of the families picked up, as well as at the family food nights. And if you want to go to the next slide, these are just some pictures, and they just had an amazing time and got exposure to some of these vegetables that they had never tried before. The next slide is my last slide, and we were thrilled that we got to actually achieve what we wanted to achieve, which first and foremost was, could this farm actually be launched and could it be expanded? And over these last several years, we tripled active usage of the acres and the food production. And we kind of learned how to do this together. So it was really something we collaborated on and got really excited about in partnership with the community. We did use the data to advocate for policy change, and Bird Creek Farm was expanded by the Osage Nation Congress in 2019. We were actually successful in our dissemination efforts. We worked with PBS, and we produced a PBS series, a documentary called Blood Sugar Rising, and that premiered April 15th. And you can find that on the PBS website, and there's a curriculum that goes with it. And we've developed a community-supported agriculture program that we're working to expand the number of family members in this reservation who get access to the healthy food, and that's the focus of our next study. So with that, I'm looking forward to discussing further with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerie. So what we're going to do now is we're going to open for discussion, although there were a couple of questions in the chat that we'll start with. Remember to raise your hand so that Carly can unmute you or pop your question into the chat box. Okay, so Cam asked, hi Cam, question for Dr. Monk. Can you give more details about how chemicals come into contact with food during the food processing?
Yeah, thanks for that question, and apologies again for going over time. I know it's a fascinating topic. It's not the most important one, but it basically, you know, like with packaging, I mean, you have thermodynamic processes that happen. You have diffusion, maybe even abrasion, and so on, different kinds of processes that happen during the processing. The phthalates are a tricky one because, of course, they're also environmental contaminants. I mean, phthalates are everywhere, and so it's really hard to nail down where exactly they're coming in from. But there was a study done in Belgium that actually found levels of phthalates highest in flour, so maybe in the mills, in milk also, so that maybe it may have come from the plastic tubing, milking machines. But that's really, those are maybes, that's not verified. But other chemicals also, I mean, if you have coatings, for example, you know, I'm thinking of my KitchenAid at home, and it's got this kneading hook, you know, so you don't have to knead the bread dough by hand. That's coated, that's an epoxy-based coating that contains bisphenol A badge and so on, and all the different side products. You know, every conveyor belt bread these days, it's not, you know, baked on a tin, it's baked on a conveyor belt, and it sort of drives through an oven in an industrial setting. What's that conveyor belt made of? It's some kind of rubber. So yeah, basically you need to know what's material specifically you're interested in, then you could drill down into what chemicals of concern can be in there, plus all the other unknowns.
Okay, thank you, Jane. A couple of other questions, and then I think if you can post your questions, I think you can, to both panelists and attendees, then I think everybody can see the questions and we can have perhaps a richer sort of discussion. Bruce asks, what are the biggest challenges to achieving your goals? And this is a Bruce question. What gives you hope? So maybe we'll start with Valerie. What do you think?
The biggest challenges to achieving our goals and what gives us hope. That's correct?
Yeah.
Challenges to achieving the goals would be probably, there's a lot of environmental issues when you're doing work with tribes where it's, you know, environmentally based. A lot of the reservation lands have a ton of pollution. There's been a lot of environmental destruction and degradation, and that's really unfortunate. For example, in the FRESH study, we had part of the reason we used a lot of the garden beds and we had to use different water sources for the farm was because the Bird Creek was heavily polluted by an oil company, which you can Google and learn about that lawsuit. So that impacts the reservation. It impacts all of the families and all of the residents. And so being aware of those things, having access to that kind of knowledge, which, you know, in these rural areas, a lot of communities, they don't know that that's going on. And so unless and until it's discovered, it's not something that we're aware of. So there's a lot of challenges there. And I think that speaks generally to doing this kind of work in low resource but high disparity communities, which is what, you know, this is. I think that one of the things that gives me the greatest hope is it's always the same thing, which is the knowledge that communities have and how they understand their own rights and responsibilities to the land, and the traditions that exist and how they've always existed and they always will exist. And that's part of what we describe as the continuity. So it's really the power of the work, the continuity of Indigenous peoples. That's its own source of purpose and value. And it's their Indigenous ways of knowing are important for everyone, not just Indigenous communities. So that's probably what gives me the most hope, my ability to be able to learn from all the time Indigenous communities.
Okay, thank you. The Suarez's, the same question, perhaps? Biggest challenges to achieving your goals and what gives you hope?
Well, one of the biggest challenges for us, and I think for everybody, is to try from academia to respond to the local needs and to develop projects that really respond to that objectives. For example, it's so important an interdisciplinary and intercultural approach if we want to really get to the communities. And that has been one of our challenges for research, to develop these projects, you know, like the nutrition project, like the Cinca farm that we have developed, and especially this public, private and community effort to find alternatives. And I think the only thing that we can do is do not think in a project. We have to think in processes, because they are processes to change the life of the people. So that's the thing that we are, a challenge is to really respond to the local needs of the people, not whatever we want to do research on.
Okay.
I would like to add the situation that perhaps one of the greatest challenges for many of our native communities are very much the imposition of certain type of international development that does not reflect the cultural beliefs and values of the local people. But at this time, the pandemic is really becoming a challenge and affecting the health of the people. But at the same time, it's stimulating the requirements from rural and urban communities about nutrition health, agroecological products. So if before there were some difficulties of some of the families to implement agroecological farms, now because they were fired from working at the flower plantations, now they are demanding the training and the support to develop agroecological projects.
Okay.
I just wanted to add one thing to this, which is changing people's behaviors. It's so complex to do that, be that at the medium level or at the large scale. After hearing the presentations of Valerie and Jane, when we're talking about demand for food packaging, right? Even fresh produce being packaged in plastic. Why is that happening? And part of it is because there's a demand for that. And if we can start making changes in that sense, then that could, we could start taking care of the production. But the same goes with the agroecological produce, right? So in this particular county where we've been working at, undernutrition has only been getting worse. So from the point when we started ISCHE in 2008, we had about 32% of children that were stunted. These are 2 standard deviations below the median of WHO. I mean, that prevalent. And now when they're adolescents, it's gotten even worse. It's about 36% of all children are stunted. And so in this setting of chronic undernutrition, there is very low also consumption of vegetables and nutritional vegetables. And that's a big cultural piece to overcome. Changing diet is such a very hard and complex thing. And I think that's one of the big challenges is how we can start having populations shift into these different nutritional patterns in this particular section. And even when you think about the sustainability of a farm, of an agroecological farm, it really depends, just like anything else, on supply and demand. And even changing in the city of Quito, increasing the demand for organic produce is something that's been growing, but still something that takes a little bit of time. So that's one of the biggest things that are challenges, I'd say, for this process.
Okay, Jane? So, yeah.
It's a beautiful question, Bruce. I'm sure each of us could talk for half an hour about it. I think that I've got a couple of biggest challenges. One of them is, as Jose Ricardo just said, changing behavior, actually, the human nature. People don't like to change. I think what we need to achieve is systemic change. And systemic change is not about quick fixes. It's not about replacing plastic straws with paper straws, right? It's about getting rid of straws altogether. It's about getting rid of, fast food altogether. It's about getting rid of industrialized agriculture. And that's huge. That's a huge undertaking. It takes a long time and it takes a lot of stakeholder buy-in, because you have to help people understand why it is that we need to achieve that systemic change, right? It's not about just solving one little symptom. We actually have to tackle, we have to tackle the human predicament, which is the way that we are living on this planet is destroying our natural environment, and it's just simply not sustainable. And so there's so many levels to that systemic change that we need to make. At the same time, we're all just human beings. We all tend to think in a reductionist way because that's how our brains have evolved over hundreds and thousands of years. And it's not part of our intuition to embrace complexity, but that's what we need to do. We have to embrace the complexity. And it goes in the direction of working with all the stakeholders. We have to embrace the values, the beliefs, of all the different stakeholders, get them on board. And that's how we have to develop solutions. And so the challenge with that then essentially is communication. And we as scientists, we love to be obscuring, we love complexity, we love details. And my challenge is to get away from, going into those nitty-gritty details, bringing it up to a broad, high level of understanding where everyone understands what actually is the problem, how does it affect me, how can I contribute to solving the problem? And what are my values, what are my thoughts on how to solve that problem? Talking about chemicals in particular is super difficult because chemicals are invisible. It's something that, you mention the word chemicals, most people's eyes start glazing over. It's like, yeah, boring, boring, boring. So to do that in an engaging and entertaining way, it is a challenge, but that's a fun challenge also, I think. Yeah, so what gives me hope? Dead whales give me hope. Beach dead whales with plastic bags in their stomachs, which is horrible, it's awful, but it's super photogenic. And that's what people suddenly are caring about. I mean, I've been talking about chemicals in plastic for the last 13 years. And suddenly, people are becoming aware of plastic pollution as an environmental issue. And now they're starting to care about that. And what I need to do now is build on that and tell them why they should care about it in their own house. Why should they care about plastics in their own house? Because they're leaching hazardous or untested chemicals into their food. And so, yeah, it's a bit weird, but yeah, that's what gives me hope. Thank you.
So let me just extend that a little bit. We'd all like, so we've got three groups of people doing some amazing work. And one of the challenges is sort of the pragmatism, right? Is Syngenta is not going away tomorrow. Getting rid of large-scale agriculture is really, really challenging for a variety of political and economic reasons. And yet we want our science to be really good science, to stand on its own, right? But to build sort of this, this base so that we can make real change. And so I get a little nervous when we say, well, let's get rid of everything and start again. I think it doesn't give our students that we mentor sort of their next step. So in that regard, there's a couple of questions about sort of strategies that might build public support for interventions, or sort of strategies that consumers or others could get on board with, so that we don't be looked at like a bunch of crazies, right? But that we are methodical, we've got the data are accumulating. Sort of, can you suggest some strategies? Anybody?
Well, maybe just to jump in there, my background is in environmental science, and the way I was trained was when you define or when you analyze a problem, that already sets you on track for finding a solution, right? So it really depends on thorough understanding and description of the problem at hand. And I think that's what I mean when I said that's where we have to embrace complexity. For example, a lot of people now are talking about, okay, we have to recycle plastic. But that actually recycling is kind of a nightmare if you think about the chemicals, right? So it's these quick fix solutions that really have to be avoided. I'm with you, Wendy. I agree. It sounds like doom and gloom, and people want agency. They want to be able to do something. That's also human nature. But still, I do think it really has to start with thorough problem understanding. And that's science.
Yes, thank you. I'm going to direct this to Valerie. Does your study have any strategy to bring back the indigenous ancestral habits for sustainable cultivation, such as to reduce the use of pesticide?
this particular study, one of the big factors that we've been talking about is just that, is we've talked about a lot of these different aspects of how do you fully incorporate indigenous foods into your diet, and what does that look like in contemporary times, and how realistic is that, and how feasible is that? And what tends to come up with communities, sorry about the background noise, this is part of working from home. I've got people inside and people outside, there's stuff going on in my house. But one of the things that tends to come up with communities is that they are currently, working 2 jobs, and they live in a rural place where they don't have time to do a lot of hunting and gathering. And so how are they going to address that? How are they going to deal with that? They want to slowly incorporate indigenous foods. That's part of what their focus is how do we do this in a feasible way? And so that's been a big area of focus, and slowly learning how to do some of these farming methods and incorporate organic farming. We visited with a native owned farm in Hawaii, Ma'o Organic Farms, and we took Osage leadership there. And that's in the documentary, is that community to community capacity building that we really fostered. We did indigenous sort of cross-cultural learning exchange with them. And we started to understand and to learn how they fostered organic farming in their environment to get away from any kind of fertilizer, pesticide type use. And so the Osage Nation has slowly started to incorporate that within their own farm. But a lot of that is building up the community capacity to be able to do that.
Thank you, Valerie. There was a question from Mark Miller for Valerie, and then we will go to the Suarez's and to Jane. How did the PBS documentary come about, and did they approach you, or was this an idea that you shopped? And I want to remind people that you can raise your hand if you'd like to make any comments in response to anything that's being said, and Carly can unmute you.
No, they definitely approached us. We are very, very communicative with our scientific program officers at NIH. We often publish a lot about our processes, so we don't wait until the end of a study to share part of the story. Our third aim in most of our studies is to usually incorporate indigenous ways of sharing knowledge, which we call it sort of story medicine. It's a big part of how we share our processes and how we share information. So it's not just focused on the publication of a scientific manuscript. A lot of it is focused on how do we communicate the way that we want to talk about this study, and in ways that are relevant to the audiences that, we want this information to go to. So we often film a lot of our meetings, and we film a lot of our community gatherings. And then we also do participatory documentary. So we do, it's like photo voice, but we do video voice. And so just through word of mouth, through sharing this information with NIMHD, through websites and our own kind of, I think, networks, we were contacted by PBS. And then part of that process was us sort of co-developing different aspects of that storyline, because a number of other communities were featured. But I think for me, part of CBPR that's so important is how you talk about the journey and the story is really, really key to how it's understood to the larger audiences. Typically, that's when a lot of communities sort of stop participating and they leave it to the academics to publish. But it's actually one of the key pieces, one of the most important pieces, is you know, how do we tell this story? We get to tell it in our own words. And so that was really part of why the documentary was important, and we said yes to it.
Great. So how about the Suarez's? How do you either advertise your work or publish, or what is your communication or translation strategy?
First, I would like to address the question in relation to strategies that were asked in relation what are we expecting, why do we do this project? And it's mainly to call the attention at the national level with the research that we are doing to change national policies that respond to the local needs. Because if you don't do that, it's very hard to make really changes. Because usually the policies are developed by, you know, some technicians that don't know the reality. And when you want to apply the national policies at the local level, they don't work. And so all the programs that are developed by the government are not successful because they are not really responding to the local reality. So in that way, I think what we have been trying to do is calling the attention with the results of the SPINA project, with the result of the Andean Nutrition Project, with the SEAL project, trying to say, here are the data. This is happening in the Ministry of Health, in the Ministry of Education. We have been doing presentations, and Jose Ricardo has been giving all this data in order to change the policies. And that's really hard also, but it's harder. Changes, as you mentioned, change of behaviors are very hard to do because that is cultural changes, and culture is a thing that you cannot change from one day to another. It's a generational changes. So, you know, it's a very complex thing, but if we work as this interdisciplinary approach, I think it's possible to do so.
Okay. Another question that was raised actually from Walter, the one-at-a-time approach of environmental toxicology is not going to deal with problems like these. What kind of academic preparation or life event experiences might train people to deal with the kind of approaches needed to do this kind of systems work? How do we train our students?
Perhaps
Anybody?
I would address that part.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Yeah, I would like to address perhaps the response to that part.
Please.
And that's, especially in the developing countries, it is very easy to see the impacts of international development, which do not address the needs of the people. And so that's the baseline around that. So when I was addressing the issue of identifying from the historical perspective, our people had been displaced from the land, from the natural resources, and now the international policies and the national policies are supporting the big farms, big enterprises, agricultural enterprises, and not really supporting to the local people. We have been advocating for many years, and the government does not provide assistance to the small farmers because they need labor force to the flower plantations. So there is a big contradiction in that part. So unless we really begin to think an alternative type of development coming from the people, which mainly means that they may go back into their ancestral agriculture, which at the same time, the new term would be agroecology, but the ancestral agroecology is very environmentally friendly. The notion of harmony that prevails among the indigenous communities, harmony within the human beings, harmony with the different human natural species, either animals or plants, with the spirits, with the ancestors. That type of harmony is at the base of a different type of civilization that we have now that's deteriorating so much the environment, as Jane was saying, and at the same time, it's so difficult to really generate those changes because the power groups are so powerful that prevent any of these possible changes.
Jane.
Yeah.
Now I'm thinking the whales are like, that's the good part.
My rebellious streak is awakening. No, I completely agree. I mean, it's up to us as individuals to wake up out of our complacency, you know. In a way, we're kind of, at least in the world where I live, you know, it's like you consume, you know, you have everything that you want, you don't have to think about it. And yeah, you do a little bit of recycling, and you know, you compensate your carbon emissions when you fly on holiday. That's not going to cut it. That's really not going to cut it. And I think the trick is not to make people think they have to sacrifice something. But as you said it so beautifully, Jose, you get so much more back by reducing consumption, by living a more conscious life, by being more spiritual and connected with nature. And I think that's really the way this needs to go, you know, to eat a tomato that was grown on proper soil, you know, with earthworms and full of microorganisms and without pesticides, and you taste the flavor. It's different, it tastes better. It's an entirely different experience. It's not just about, yeah, there's no pesticides in there. There's more than that. It's a different attitude towards life. And it's probably almost like a, missionary job, you know, to convert people. I don't know how to do that. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a sociologist. I'll leave that to those colleagues. But I fully agree. It's not a technical problem. It's not a scientific problem. It's the human behavior that needs.
So in terms of training our students, our postdocs, you know, the sort of the next gen, what should we be, how should we be doing this? What are we missing?
They need to work interdisciplinary. You can't bury yourself in your silos. Like, as a, you know, even in our world of, you know, life science, if you talk about spirituality, a lot of people go like, oh, don't. Like, that's part of us, you know. So yeah, let's be much more interdisciplinary. That's my vote.
Interdisciplinary, but I have a great deal of hope, because even in just the relatively small time between my training at UC Berkeley in the early 2000s until now, there's been a huge shift in the openness to multi-level, multi-component systems level thinking. And it's not just the openness to it, it's a mandate almost from NIH and the other leading funders that we have to think like this. And as Indigenous people, we've always thought like this. Just as Jose said, we've always known that this is not a sustainable way of living. It's not sustainable. So it's not a surprise to us what's happening. But even just like last year, I think NIH held its first traditional ecological knowledge panel and brought in speakers. So I think when you're not just doing interdisciplinary work, and that's the expectation for students now, which it is, but you're also integrating community ways of knowing, community knowledge. Communities know what's happening. They know what's happening, and they know that the truth is on our side. So I feel that we have a lot going for us. And I think the earth's telling us to be hopeful. That's what our elders say, and I believe it. It's panels like this where we're talking about things we never would have talked about 20 years ago. It was a fringe discussion, and now it's a level of openness that the planet is ready to learn these things. I really believe and see that, and you see it in the work of the people on this panel. This is becoming the norm.
And very briefly, just to address about how do we prepare our students, those who are interested in public health, I would say step into the community, look at the problem, understand the problem, not really give them the opportunity to not analyze the problem using a telescope, but being immersed into that. And just the fact of stepping into any community brings the whole knowledge, all the learnings in public health or epidemiology, et cetera, just puts flesh and bone to that whole thing.
I absolutely agree, Jose and Valerie and Jane. And yet I look at the funding availabilities for our work, and I look at the flashy, we call it the, the flashy item of the day, which is you're going to use big data to solve these problems. And I see this as one of the realistic challenges as we really, I'll call it what it is, compete for limited resources to do this kind of holistic, multidisciplinary work. And one thing that I think we all think about is how do we change or affect the system so that maybe we need the big data for hypothesis generating, et cetera, but those are up there in the ether as opposed to being on the ground with the people. So I'm not here to to give my, my philosophy, but that is a challenge for as we train our students as we move forward. We speak about one thing and yet we push them into these projects because that's where the funding is. So Dolores and then Jane.
Yeah, following what you are saying, I think it's very important, an intercultural approach. That's something that we have to learn. And it has to be a change not only for our students, but for ourselves. Learning to see the other as equal, not tolerant, because when we talk about multiculturalism, it's seeing the other and be tolerant with the other, and that's not good. We are so good that we tolerate the other. The cultural approach means we want to see the other as equal. We are going to sit on the same table and develop a strategy to overcome undernutrition. Why? How do you think we could do that? But seeing the other as equal. And that's something that we have to change in ourselves every day. In the relationship with your partner, with your friends, with your coworker. An intercultural approach is really a change of life. And that means a lot of work for everyone because everybody is trespassed by power and nobody wants to overcome the power that we have. So that's a challenge for us as academicians and for the students. We want to teach them to be different and to respect the difference and the other.
Thank you, Dolores. And Jane?
Yeah, I fully agree with that. I think it boils down to communication and having a dialogue, which means you speak as much as you listen. And I think that's super important to really listen to what others have to say and to other perspectives and, other values systems. And, to address what you were saying, Wendy, yeah, of course, that's where the funding is. But I think, again, it's communication. It's how you tell a good story about the work that you want to do, how you develop a narrative. And I think in science, we have to get so much better at that. It's huge room for improvement. And that's also a lot of hope there, we can get so much better. We see how politicians just spew out lies and people believe them only because they have a compelling narrative. So let's use the power of narrative to talk truth. I think there's a lot of room for improvement there.
Okay. Thank you. I know that, okay, Jose, I have to make it brief because I'm looking at the time.
Okay, my comment would be, what have we learned from this pandemic? And that's very much at the core of the issues that we are discussing. For example, individuality in relation to group work, being responsible for the community is one of the important components that all of us, and also in the academia, we have to teach our students.
Thank you. And I'm looking at the time. It's really time for us to end this conversation. And I thank you very, very much to the presenters and to all of the attendees. As ISCHE only functions when our membership is active, right? We encourage you to join with us in future work. And we wish you and yours the best of health. And Bruce, Mark, Carly, and I thank you all for joining today. So, thank you.
Gracias.
For the opportunity.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.